Federal Reserve, over the last few days, has announced a bunch of programs that are designed to help the national and global economy stay afloat during this ongoing coronavirus crisis. Many of these steps are reminiscent of the steps the Federal Reserve took during the 2008 financial crisis. Those programs were controversial then. They will certainly continue to be controversial now. Watching social media, I see a lot of the same bad information floating around that we saw in 2008. Terms like bailouts being thrown around, taxpayer money. The purpose of this video is to sift through that social media noise and make sure we create an accurate picture of what's going on. Now, I think it's important that we take a step back to define what the Federal Reserve is and what it is not. Now, first, despite having the word federal in the name, it's technically not part of the federal government. We're going to be talking about the role of the Federal Reserve, which is an independent central bank, and not the federal government, which is Congress, the executive branch, the judicial branch. So you're probably asking yourself, Mr. Dale, the Federal Reserve is a central bank and not part of the federal government. Great. What does that mean? Well, central banks have a stated objective of managing the amount of money available in an economy. We refer to it as the money supply. And this is in an effort to control inflation, or the amount prices go up over some specified period of time, usually a year. In addition to that, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 outlines three core goals for the Federal Reserve. The first is to stabilize prices. So again, managing the amount of money to ensure that it is not going to cause a lot of inflation or deflation where prices go down. The second goal is to ensure maximum employment, make sure that everybody within the economy that wants a job can get one. And the last is perhaps the trickiest to wrap your heads around. It's the idea that the Federal Reserve has to manage interest rates, or the amount of money that you pay to borrow money from entities. And that includes the amount of money I pay to borrow money from a bank to start a business or buy a house, all the way up to the amount of money or interest rate that banks pay to borrow money from each other or from the Federal Reserve itself. So the Fed has three different tools in its toolbox it can use to try and achieve these goals. The first tool is to manage what's known as the reserve requirement. The reserve requirement is the amount of money a bank must hold on to relative to the amount of money it can lend out. So if the reserve requirement is 10%, if it's lending $1,000, it must have in its reserves $100. The second tool is to manage interest rates directly. There's two interest rates of interest that you would want to keep in mind here. The first is the discount rate, or the amount of interest that must be paid to the Federal Reserve when a bank borrows money directly from the Federal Reserve. And the second is what's known as the federal funds rate, or the interest rate that must be paid to another bank whenever a bank borrows money from another bank. Now, the last tool is perhaps the most controversial, and it's the one that's going to make the most headlines, and this is known as open market operations. This is where the Fed will go out and buy certain securities, usually U.S. debt, from large banks or securities brokers. So this next clip is an analyst on MSNBC talking about the steps the Federal Reserve is taking right now in an effort to try and slow down and prevent this potential economic downturn. What I'm going to challenge you guys to do is just listen to the tools that are being used and see if you can identify which tools in particular the Fed is using. We'll talk a little bit about them after the clip, but for now, let's take a listen.
News to get out there on something not related, at least to the White House directly, and that is the Federal Reserve. According to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, looks like this was coming off an embargo right at 5 p.m. has just announced that they're further lowering their interest rates in the 0 to 0.25 range, essentially bringing interest rates all the way down to zero. That is a remarkable emergency move by the Federal Reserve. It gives you an indication of how concerned they are about what's happening in the economy. And there's also some assets purchased in there, which, not to wonk out too much, but is known as quantitative easing. I think the Times put it at 50 to 200, 500 to 200 billion. Excuse me here, in all the excitement, I realized I've taken off my microphone, so I'm going to just slide it up here. But the news is, according to other news organizations, the Journal, the Post, the New York Times, the Fed has acted, and they have acted in a way that is quite dramatic, lowering interest rates almost down to zero. It was just yesterday that I asked the president whether or not he thought he had the authority to fire Jay Powell, the chair, and the president said he had the authority. He wasn't making a decision. So we'll get into the details of what this Fed decision means and the specifics on asset purchases. But I think overall, it is an indication that people at the Federal Reserve are very concerned about the state of the economy and what coronavirus can do to not just the United States economy, but a global slowdown. Richard?
Yeah.
So aside from this dude being a bit of a goober and forgetting to put his microphone on, there's good stuff here that we should be happy to see. He talks about the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates to really low levels. That's going to be the federal funds rate, which I'll show you here in a second. And he also talks about some really big open market operations that are going to take place. Again, this is good news because it shows the Federal Reserve is willing to do the things they need to do to make a possible recession be much smaller, or maybe even prevent one from occurring at all. So right here, we're looking at the federal funds rate from 2005 to 2010. In the clip, the analyst talked about lowering interest rates to near zero. Did you guys catch that? He's referring specifically to the federal funds rate. You'll recall from earlier in the video, the federal funds rate is the interest rate banks charge each other when they lend each other money, and it's set by the Federal Reserve. So in 2008, they tried to lower this rate after the recession had started in an effort to create economic activity. The logic would be the lower the interest rate, the more likely banks are to borrow money, and the more likely they are to borrow money, the more likely they are to use that money to lend out to start a business or to buy a house. Here's that same federal funds rate from December 2019 until today. You see that same dramatic drop going to near zero levels at about 0.25%. What you don't see is that gray box showing or indicating that we're in a recession. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that the problem with recessions is you don't know one's coming until you're already in it. We have to get economic data from a whole bunch of different touch points in order to confirm this is in fact a recession. We just won't have that for at least a few weeks, maybe months. In addition to that, you have to keep in mind that the Federal Reserve went through 2008. They were aware of what worked and what didn't work and what steps had to be taken. So an encouraging sign here is that the Federal Reserve may simply be getting ahead of the recession and trying to lessen how deep it is or lessen the impact. And instead of seeing like another 2008, these drastic measures done early might make this more of like a 1990-1991 recession, just a real small one. So once interest rates are pushed to near zero levels, what else can the Federal Reserve do? They've never tried negative interest rates, so more than likely we're going to see what is known as quantitative easing as the next set of tools the Federal Reserve tries to leverage. Quantitative easing is a technique that was popular in the 2008 to 2014 period during and after the Great Recession, where the Federal Reserve purchased large amounts of assets using open market operations. Whereas a normal open market operation might be to the tune of say $30 to $100 billion, this first round alone of quantitative easing is going to be $700 billion, and we're more than likely going to see a few rounds of this. In addition to it being much larger, they're also going to purchase different types of assets. In normal open market operations, they're purchasing short-term U.S. debt, whereas in this round alone, they're looking at purchasing longer-term U.S. debt, as well as municipal debt, which is debt issued from a municipality, which is like a county or a city. So Las Vegas, for example, might have some of their debt purchased out on the open market. This is good because it makes it easier for municipalities to borrow money, which means they can pay the bills and keep the lights on. So in the coming weeks and months, it's really, really important that we continue to remember what the Federal Reserve can and cannot do. What it can do is the steps that it's already beginning to take to try and lower interest rates, to encourage lending and spending, to infuse cash into the economy via open market operations where it buys U.S. debt. What it can't do is provide a bailout to a failing industry. If, say, the airline industry ends up needing some type of quick infusion of cash coming from a non-private sector source like the government, they would have to go to Congress for that. The Federal Reserve also doesn't have any access to our tax revenue. That's all within the Treasury, so they wouldn't be able to spend our tax money. They wouldn't be able to dictate how our tax money will be directed. They wouldn't be able to increase our taxes. What they can do, they have essentially already begun to do, and it's what we covered here in this video. So on that note, guys, I hope you enjoyed it. I know it's not perfect in terms of the production quality, but I'm putting this together kind of last minute. If you have suggestions or ideas or more topics you want to hear covered, please let me know. I'm more than happy to keep cranking these out if you guys are finding any value in them. Thanks.